There's a particular kind of suffering that quietly gnaws at those who pay attention. It's the frustration that arises when you're surrounded by people who exude confidence, speak with certainty, and act like authorities, yet everything they say or do reveals a deep, embarrassing ignorance. It's not just annoying, it's psychologically exhausting. It feels like an insult to your intelligence, like reality itself is flipped upside down. And what's worse, they often get more attention, more validation, and sometimes more success than those who actually know what they're talking about. If you felt this, you're not crazy, and you're definitely not alone. What you're experiencing is not just arrogance or stupidity, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect in full swing. And it's a psychological trap that has more to do with human cognition than with individual malice. But to understand why this happens, and more importantly how to psychologically navigate it, we need to go deeper. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias wherein people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. In simpler terms, the less someone knows, the more confident they tend to be. Why? Because ignorance robs you of the very tools you'd need to recognize your own ignorance. Imagine a person who doesn't know how gravity works trying to debate a physicist. They're so far removed from the actual mechanics of the subject that they can't even see how wrong they are. To them, their logic feels airtight because they're using a broken ruler to measure the world, unaware it's broken. This is not just a glitch in some people. It's a fundamental part of how the human mind protects itself from shame. It's easier to believe you're right than to confront the terrifying idea that you're not. Even on the other hand, people who genuinely understand complex things tend to be filled with doubt. They know how much they don't know. They've been humbled by the depth of the subject. They've seen the intricacies, the contradictions, the exceptions to every rule. And because they've gone through this journey of learning, their confidence is quiet, reserved, and cautious. That humility, while noble, often gets overshadowed in a world that rewards certainty over substance. This creates a perverse system. The loudest voices dominate even when they are the most misinformed. But this isn't just a social issue. For you, it becomes personal. If you've ever left a conversation feeling like you were just steamrolled by someone who was confidently wrong, you know the emotional toll it takes. You start to question yourself. Maybe you weren't articulate enough. Maybe you should have spoken up more. Maybe you should have used simpler words. Or maybe you shouldn't have engaged at all. This internal conflict can fester. It can erode your self-esteem, especially when you see the same people praised or promoted. Your ego isn't just bruised, it's being gaslighted by a world that doesn't seem to value depth or truth. But here's the psychological trick. Your mind plays on you. Because you're aware of your limitations, you naturally assume others must be more competent than they actually are. Your ability to self-reflect becomes a source of pain because you compare your internal doubts with their external confidence. That's not a fair comparison. You're seeing the inside of your mind, filled with nuance and uncertainty, while only seeing the outside of theirs, polished and performative. Confidence is not a reliable measure of intelligence. In fact, it's often the opposite. Those who are the most certain are often the ones who have explored the least. Philosophers like Socrates understood this centuries ago. "I know that I know nothing," he famously said. That wasn't a declaration of ignorance, it was a statement of wisdom. True intelligence begins with the recognition of one's limits. But in today's world, that mindset often gets dismissed as weakness. We live in an era where image dominates substance, where people are rewarded for how well they present, rather than how well they understand. Social media amplifies this problem. Platforms are built on attention, not accuracy. And confidence, even when baseless, draws more attention than caution ever could. As a result, the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just a psychological quirk, it's a cultural epidemic. But now that you see it, you can begin to detach. You can stop internalizing it. When you hear someone speaking with overwhelming confidence on a topic they clearly don't understand, remember, they're not smarter than you. They're not better informed. They're simply unaware of how little they know. And that unawareness is a kind of armor, flimsy, but effective in short-term social dynamics. It's not your job to fix them, and it's not your fault if they can't see what you see. What matters is how you hold yourself together in a world that often rewards illusions. You must remember, your discomfort is a sign of depth. It means you're not numb. It means you care about truth. It means you're still capable of thinking beyond the surface. That's rare, that's powerful, but it can also be isolating. So here's the philosophical shift. Instead of trying to be understood by everyone, focus on becoming unshakable within yourself. Ground your confidence not in how much you know compared to others, but in how deeply you're willing to keep learning. Let their overconfidence expose itself. Let your silence speak volumes. Real intelligence doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't scream to be heard. It just is. This doesn't mean you have to stay quiet. It means you choose your battles. You protect your energy. You learn to speak with clarity and calm authority when it matters, and let the noise pass you by when it doesn't. Your ego might still feel bruised at times, and that's okay. It's human. But ego heals when you build inner strength, not by defeating others, but by understanding yourself. Don't let the fools drive you to bitterness. Let them expose themselves. Time always tells. And the people who shine the longest are rarely the ones who burn the brightest at first. They're the ones who stay steady, learn continuously, and keep their integrity intact. So if you feel surrounded by idiots who think they're brilliant, know this. What you're feeling is not madness, it's awareness. The world is full of noise, but wisdom, real wisdom, doesn't need to shout. It listens, it observes, it endures, and eventually it prevails. The pain you feel, the frustration, the quiet anger, the internal burn when someone confidently misrepresents reality is not weakness. It's not hypersensitivity. It's the tension between awareness and illusion. It's what happens when a conscious thinking person is forced to watch a stage where ignorance parades as genius, and no one in the crowd seems to notice the difference. You see it everywhere, in workplaces where shallow charisma trumps skill, in politics where slogans overpower substance, in conversations where loudness is mistaken for logic. And if you're a thoughtful person, it starts to feel like you're living in a world that actively punishes intelligence while celebrating the mask of it. That cognitive dissonance eats at you. It makes you question not just others but yourself. Why do they seem so confident? Why do people believe them? Why doesn't anyone else notice the absurdity? And perhaps the most painful question of all, am I the one who's missing something? This is where psychology and philosophy intersect in a way that can liberate you, because the truth is, confidence and competence are often inversely correlated, especially in complex domains. The less you know, the easier it is to think you've grasped it. This is the illusion of simplicity. It's easy to have strong opinions when you've only scratched the surface, but dive deeper and certainty dissolves. You begin to see layers, contradictions, exceptions. That's when true understanding begins, but it comes at the cost of naive confidence. This process is deeply uncomfortable. It destabilizes the ego, and that's why many people avoid it altogether. They cling to certainty, not because it's accurate, but because it's emotionally convenient. They speak with conviction, not because they're right, but because it feels good. Confidence becomes a drug. It rewards them socially. It shields them from self-doubt, and they mistake that feeling for truth. Meanwhile, those who are genuinely self-aware often hesitate. They pause. They consider different angles. That humility, while intellectually honest, is mistaken for weakness in a world obsessed with appearances. But this isn't a reason to become cynical. It's a reason to become strategic. If you're the kind of person who thinks deeply, who feels the weight of complexity, then your struggle isn't a defect. It's a sign that you're awake in a world that rewards sleepwalking. That can be lonely, but it also means you have the ability to see what others can't. That awareness is your gift, but only if you learn to use it with emotional discipline. You must stop expecting validation from the unaware. They can't see you. They're not even looking. They're looking for reflections of themselves, echoes of their own beliefs, not challenges to them. And when you don't fit that mold, you become invisible or inconvenient. This doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you've outgrown the framework they're still trapped in. And that's not something they'll thank you for. In fact, they'll often resent you for it. You become a mirror that threatens to reveal their own ignorance. So they'll mock, dismiss, or ignore you, not because you're unworthy, but because they're afraid. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes powerful. The Stoics taught that your peace cannot depend on the recognition of others. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject." Your worth is not determined by how many people agree with you. It's measured by how closely you live in alignment with truth. And truth doesn't need applause. It simply is. Seneca warned against being swept away by the madness of the crowd. He believed that clarity was rare and that to preserve your sanity, you must train yourself to stand alone if necessary. That doesn't mean isolation. It means inner fortitude. It means knowing what you know even when others don't see it yet. It means being anchored in reality while others drift in illusions of their own making. That's not arrogance. It's responsibility. Still, this clarity won't save you from pain. In fact, it may cause more of it, at least for a while. Because seeing clearly makes the fog of the world more unbearable. It sharpens your awareness of stupidity, of injustice, of falsehoods being praised while truth is buried. But it also gives you power, the power to choose how you respond. You can stay silent when silence is wise. You can speak with precision when truth must be heard. You can remove yourself from toxic dynamics without guilt. You can stop trying to wake up those who are determined to sleep. Eventually, you begin to understand the deeper game. Most people aren't seeking truth, they're seeking comfort, and comfort is found in familiarity, not in facts. So when someone speaks confidently, even if they're wrong, they create an illusion of certainty that others find soothing. That's why the most confident fool can gain followers, while the quiet genius is ignored. But remember, the goal is not to be seen. The goal is to see. And to act from that vision with discipline, with grace, and with unshakable self-respect. The moment you internalize this, something changes. You stop trying to win against the ignorant. You stop wasting energy proving your value to those who are incapable of recognizing it. You stop fighting battles that aren't worthy of your mind. Instead, you conserve your power. You build it. You protect it. And over time, that inner power creates a presence. One that doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to compete, doesn't need to prove. It just exists. And that kind of presence speaks louder than any empty confidence ever could. You'll start to recognize others like you. Quiet minds, thoughtful people. Not loud, not flashy, but grounded. They don't dominate the room, but they shape it. They listen more than they speak. They ask deeper questions. They move differently. These are your allies. These are your people. And when you connect with them, the world begins to feel less hostile, less absurd, less lonely. But until then, carry yourself with the dignity of someone who knows the difference between illusion and truth. Let fools be fools. Let the loud have their stage. You don't need their spotlight. You have something far rarer: clarity. Protect it, cultivate it, trust it. And above all, never let the noise make you doubt your own mind. Because while the world may be loud, it is rarely wise. And the ones who whisper the truth, those are the ones who shape it. The deeper you descend into self-awareness, the more you begin to understand that most people aren't malicious. They're simply unconscious. They're not deliberately pretending to be smarter than they are. They truly believe in their own brilliance. That's what makes the Dunning-Kruger effect so insidious. It's not arrogance born of choice, it's arrogance born of ignorance. And once you realize this, your resentment can slowly evolve into detachment. You don't have to hate them. You just have to stop expecting them to be something they're not capable of being. They haven't yet developed the awareness to recognize their own limitations. And that's a long, uncomfortable road that many people will never willingly walk. It requires humility. It requires ego death. And most people would rather protect their fragile illusion of intelligence than face the pain of truly seeing themselves. But you've already begun that process. That's why it hurts so much. You've stepped outside the illusion, and now you see the cracks in everything. You see the hollowness behind the confidence. You see the blind leading the blind. And perhaps most painfully, you see how little that matters in a world built on perception. That's where many men and women get stuck. They wake up, they see the lie, and then they become bitter. Cynicism creeps in. The instinct to mock others, to retreat into superiority, to say, let them rot in their ignorance, where this becomes seductive. But if you go down that path, you haven't escaped the trap. You've just built a different prison, one where your identity is still chained to comparison. The real freedom comes when you let go of the need to compare at all, when you no longer care who's smarter or who's more respected, when you don't feel the urge to prove yourself because you've already proven everything to the only person who matters, yourself. That's the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs to perform. You don't have to win debates. You don't have to correct every fool. You don't need the crowd's validation. You know who you are, and that knowledge makes you immune to the chaos of others. This is where philosophy arms you with something psychology alone cannot: transcendence. Psychology can explain the mechanisms, it can diagnose the patterns, but philosophy gives you the strength to rise above them. It teaches you how to suffer with dignity, how to turn frustration into fuel, how to stay still while the world spins in delusion. The Stoics called this ataraxia, a state of unshakable peace, not because the world is peaceful, but because you've learned not to be disturbed by it. In that stillness, you begin to see the game for what it is. Most people are just acting out scripts they've inherited, scripts written by culture, by media, by the illusion of certainty. And when someone overestimates their intelligence, it's not just a personal flaw. It's a reflection of a system that taught them that confidence is the highest virtue, and that doubt is weakness. In reality, doubt is the seed of wisdom. Without it, you never grow. You just recycle your beliefs, trapped in a loop of self-confirmation. When you look back at history, you'll see that the truly wise were almost always misunderstood. Socrates was condemned. Galileo was silenced. Nietzsche died in madness. These were not fools. They were men who saw too clearly, too soon. And the e.g. world, blind to their vision, punished them for their insight. So don't expect recognition for seeing what others can't. Expect resistance, expect ridicule, but also expect growth, deep, transformative growth that only comes from choosing truth over comfort. Eventually, something strange happens. The more you accept that others may never understand you, the less you need them to. The more you accept that many will think they're brilliant while refusing to learn, the freer you become. You start focusing on your own evolution. You read more, you reflect more, you build quietly. You get sharper, calmer, stronger. And over time, you become the kind of person who doesn't just know things, but embodies them. There's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence can be loud. Wisdom is always quiet. And when you finally speak, it's not to impress, it's to illuminate. Your words come from a place of clarity, not ego. You no longer seek to be the smartest person in the room. You seek to make the room smarter, even if no one notices. Because you've learned something few ever do. Greatness is not about being recognized, it's about being real. So the next time you feel surrounded by people who are convinced of their own brilliance, don't let your ego be provoked. Let your awareness deepen. Let your understanding grow. Smile at their confidence, not with mockery, but with compassion. You were there once too. Maybe not in that same form, but in some way, you too thought you knew more than you did. We all begin blind. The goal is not to escape blindness entirely, but to see more clearly than we did yesterday. Let the fools talk. Let them shine. Let them be certain. While they chase applause, you chase truth. While they build personas, you build character. While they overestimate themselves, you refine yourself. Because in the end, when the noise fades and the spotlight dims, only one question will matter. Did you live aligned with truth, or did you chase the illusion? If you chose truth, even when it hurt, even when it made you feel alone, then you've already won. Not in the eyes of the crowd, perhaps, but in the quiet chambers of your own soul. And that, in the end, is the only place that matters. You will find that as your self-awareness deepens, so does your silence. Not the silence of submission or shyness, but the silence of discernment. The kind of silence that comes from knowing that most words are wasted on ears that don't want to hear. That most arguments are not a search for truth, but a struggle for dominance. And that trying to prove your intelligence to the unaware is like trying to explain color to someone who has always been blind. It's not your responsibility to fix people who aren't ready. It's not your burden to carry their ignorance on your shoulders. Your task is simpler and far more difficult: to remain rooted in truth and to keep growing no matter what surrounds you. This doesn't mean you withdraw from the world completely. In fact, the opposite is true. You become more effective in it. Because once your ego is no longer triggered by every arrogant fool, you move differently. You become calm in chaos. You speak only when it serves a purpose. You no longer waste energy reacting to every offense or proving yourself in rooms where depth isn't even understood, let alone valued. That is power. Not the kind that intimidates with volume, but the kind that stabilizes with presence. The kind of power that makes others listen, not because you're loud, but because you're anchored. You'll start to notice something else. When you stop chasing recognition from people who lack depth, your world begins to shift. You attract different people, people who see you, not just the mask, not just the surface, but you. Your clarity, your questions, your standards. These connections are rare, but they are worth more than 1,000 shallow ones. One conversation with someone who has really thought is worth more than 100 conversations with someone who only thinks they know. And as you rise, you'll see the same patterns playing out again and again. Overconfidence masking ignorance, volume overpowering value, style over substance. But now you're not disturbed by it. You expect it. You know what it is. And because you understand the mechanism, it no longer has the power to make you feel small. You've outgrown the need to compare. You've outgrown the need to react. There's a moment, quiet, subtle, but undeniable, when you realize you don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. That you are not in competition. That the game they're playing is not the game you were born to win. You're not here to dominate. You're here to evolve. You're not here to outshine fools. You're here to master yourself. This shift changes everything. It changes how you think, how you speak, how you listen. You become more precise, more intentional. You don't waste time trying to be understood by everyone. You realize that being misunderstood by the wrong people is a form of protection. Their rejection is actually a filter. It keeps you focused, it keeps you aligned, and it keeps you from diluting yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold your depth. When you walk this path long enough, you develop what some philosophers and mystics have called the second silence. The first silence is external, not speaking. The second silence is internal, not needing to speak. It's a silence born of knowing, of watching, of waiting. You learn to sit with your thoughts longer than others can. You learn to delay reaction, to resist the pull of the ego. This gives you a kind of presence that can't be faked. People notice it even if they don't understand it. They feel it, and they respect it, even if they can't explain why. This is how you become powerful in a world full of performance, not by competing in the circus, but by walking calmly past it. Not by shouting back at every clown who calls himself a king, but by becoming someone whose silence speaks louder than their noise. And that kind of presence, unbothered, self-contained, aware, is unbreakable, because it comes from within. No one gave it to you, and that means no one can take it away. But don't mistake this for superiority. That would be another illusion. This path requires constant humility. You must remind yourself daily, you too are blind to some things. You too are flawed, biased, limited. That's why you keep learning. That's why you never stop questioning yourself. You use your awareness not as a weapon, but as a compass. Not to judge others, but to stay aligned with what's true. And that's the final paradox. The more clearly you see others' delusions, the more compassion you develop. Not pity, not indulgence, but real compassion. The understanding that most people are trapped in their own mental cages, fighting battles they don't understand, defending identities built on fragile illusions. They think they're brilliant, not because they are, but because the alternative is too painful to face. You'll remember times when you too were certain of things that turned out to be false. Times when you mistook volume for truth, confidence for clarity. And you'll forgive yourself. That forgiveness will teach you how to forgive others, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. And so, slowly, the anger fades, the ego heals, the pain transforms. What once felt like isolation becomes solitude. What once felt like rejection becomes redirection. And what once felt like a world full of idiots becomes a world full of teachers, each one showing you what not to become. You stop trying to convince people. You focus instead on becoming undeniable. Not in words, but in presence. Not in arguments, but in how you carry yourself. And when you do speak, it's like a scalpel, clean, sharp, precise, because now your voice comes from a place of truth, not insecurity, from mastery, not ego. And the world, though it may not understand you, begins to feel you. That's what real influence looks like. That's what real freedom feels like. So yes, you may feel surrounded by idiots who think they're brilliant, but remember, you're not here to wake them all up. You're here to stay awake yourself. And that, quietly, steadily, relentlessly, is how you change the world. Not by shouting at the blind, but by lighting your own fire so brightly that others can't help but see the glow. Eventually, something in you begins to shift at a deeper level. You no longer crave the validation you once did. You stop longing for the world to acknowledge your insight or recognize your intellect, not because you've given up, but because you've grown beyond needing external affirmation to confirm internal truths. The applause you once chased becomes meaningless noise. You start to realize that the opinions of the blind cannot define the vision of the seeing, that clarity does not beg for recognition. It simply exists, solid, unmoved, timeless. And in this stillness, you begin to walk through life differently. You listen more than you speak, not out of insecurity, but out of strength. You observe the overconfident speak with bravado about things they barely understand, and you don't interrupt them. Not because you can't, but because you understand that nothing you say will break their illusion until reality itself eventually does. And when it does, they won't remember the truth you once tried to offer. They'll only remember the pain of their own fall. That is how most people learn, through consequence, not counsel. This is why the wise are so often quiet. Not because they don't know, but because they know too much. They've seen the futility of arguing with ego. They've learned that awakening cannot be forced. It must be chosen. So they don't try to push others into the light. They simply become the light. They focus on their own discipline, their own refinement, their own path. They live in such alignment with truth that their very existence becomes a challenge to the delusions of others. And when people are ready, truly ready, they come to you. Not because you sought them out, but because in a world filled with noise and fakery and false confidence, your presence is a signal, a quiet, undeniable signal of depth, clarity, and power. They come not to be entertained, but to be changed. They come not for answers, but for questions that awaken something dormant in them. And in those moments, you become what few ever become, a catalyst, a reminder, a mirror of what's possible. But all of this is only possible because you refused to be broken by the madness of the world. You chose to stay grounded when others drifted. You chose to keep learning when others settled into certainty. You chose humility over performance, clarity over popularity, truth over comfort. And that choice, the one you make again and again, in silence, in solitude, in the privacy of your own mind, that choice is what separates you from the noise. This path is not glamorous. It is not loud. It does not come with applause or rewards. Often it comes with loneliness, with misunderstanding, with periods of doubt. But it also comes with something far greater, self-possession. You begin to feel at home within yourself. You become your own source of strength, of validation, of purpose. You don't bend in the face of ignorance because you are no longer trying to belong to a world that does not see clearly. And as time passes, you begin to appreciate this journey for what it truly is, a refinement of your soul. The fools who think they're brilliant are not your enemies. They are your tests, your teachers. They give you the chance to practice patience, to practice detachment, to practice the art of non-reaction, and most importantly, they remind you of who you do not want to become. Their delusion becomes your clarity. Their arrogance becomes your humility. Their noise becomes your silence. In that silence, you grow, quietly, powerfully. You become someone who no longer chases anything but attracts everything. Wisdom, connection, influence. Not because you demanded them, but because you became the kind of person worthy of them. The kind of person who doesn't need to be seen to have impact. The kind of person who doesn't need to be right to live in truth. And when you do speak, when the rare moment comes that calls for your voice, it cuts through the fog like lightning, not because it's loud, but because it's real. People feel it. They can't always articulate why, but they know there's weight behind your words, they know there's depth behind your calm, and even if they can't understand you fully, they respect the energy you carry. So keep walking your path. Keep building in silence. Keep refining your mind like a blade. Let others perform, let them boast, let them convince themselves of their brilliance. You don't need to follow, you don't need to compete, you don't need to prove anything. Because while the world is busy applauding those who shine with borrowed light, you are becoming the kind of person who burns with something real, something no one can take from you. That's how you rise in a world that has lost its sense of depth. That's how you stay sane in a world addicted to illusion. And that's how you win, not with noise but with presence, not with pride but with principle, not by standing above others, but by standing firmly in truth, quietly, powerfully, unshakably. And as this quiet power settles into your bones, you begin to embody something rare in this age of endless noise: congruence. The outer matches the inner. Your words match your actions. Your beliefs match your behavior. You are no longer split between image and identity. You don't perform clarity, you live it. And that alone sets you apart from almost everyone you'll meet. Most people are fragmented. They wear masks for different rooms. They adjust themselves to fit the mood. They say what will earn applause and believe what causes the least discomfort, but not you. Because you've paid the price of awareness, you've wrestled with yourself. You've faced the bitter truths about your own ignorance. And in doing so, you've built something unshakable: integrity. Integrity is not just about morality. It's about unity, wholeness. It's the rare state of being undivided, where you no longer feel the need to fracture yourself to be accepted. You stand as one, fully, completely. And in that state, even your silence speaks louder than the loudest fools shouting. This is the point where the game truly ends, for you. Not because you've won it, but because you've outgrown it. You see it for what it is: an endless theater of people playing roles they didn't choose, chasing applause they don't need, defending egos they don't understand. And while they argue about who is the smartest, you focus on being the clearest. While they fight over recognition, you invest in transformation. While they seek dominance, you seek truth. And this doesn't make you passive, quite the opposite. It makes you deliberate. You still speak, but now your words are weapons of precision, not emotion. You still act, but now your actions are guided by principle, not impulse. You still compete, but now your only opponent is the version of yourself that settled for less. Because you know what happens when you stop trying to prove your intelligence. You start becoming wise, and wisdom doesn't need a stage. It doesn't demand followers, it doesn't boast. It whispers, it humbles, it frees. You begin to live for the unseen victories, the mental discipline of not reacting, the emotional strength of remaining kind in the face of arrogance, the inner triumph of choosing growth over ego. These are the victories that matter, the victories that change. The victories no one will ever applaud, but that will echo inside your soul for the rest of your life. There is a sacred dignity in that kind of path, a silent nobility. You're no longer moved by who thinks they're smarter than you. You don't feel the need to correct every delusion or to confront every inflated ego, because you've transcended the game of appearance. You've stepped into the realm of essence, and essence doesn't need validation. It simply is. So what do you do when you feel surrounded by people who think they're brilliant, but show no evidence of real understanding? You keep walking. You keep studying, not to prove them wrong, but to keep sharpening yourself. You keep listening, not because they're right, but because every fool teaches you something about your own restraint. You keep creating, not because the world will recognize your genius, but because you were born to bring order to chaos, clarity to confusion, light to the dark. You don't fight them. You don't mock them. You outgrow them. You rise not above them, but into yourself. And maybe years from now, some of them will look back and remember the way you carried yourself, the way you didn't need to shout, the way you didn't need to prove, the way you didn't flinch when they underestimated you. And maybe then they'll understand. Maybe then they'll begin their own journey inward. But by that time, you'll be somewhere far ahead. Not just in knowledge, but in peace. Not just in status, but in spirit. Because you chose the harder path, the quieter path. The path that doesn't end in applause, but in mastery, and in a world full of noise. That kind of man, that kind of woman, that kind of presence becomes unforgettable.